First-time Sergeant Dara Voss noticed the sky had changed. She was on her back, under a wrecked crawler, slick to the elbows in hydraulic fluid, trying not to think about her daughter. The morning was cold and gray, and the eastern hills of the Vashti settlement had that bruised look they got before a dust storm, and she did not look up. She had a bearing to replace, and 12 minutes before the supply run, and looking at the sky had not done anyone in Vashti any good for the last 4 months. That was how long it had been watching. The thing they called the electric eye had no name of its own, or if it did, it never shared that name with humanity. It had arrived in geostationary orbit over the northern hemisphere on a Tuesday in early autumn, and for the first 3 days people had celebrated contact, the Great Hope. 100 governments and 17 private aerospace companies had aimed everything they had into the dark and screamed hello in every language they possessed. And the electric eye had simply hung there, 240 kilometers up, and watched. Its surface was smooth and black and rotated almost imperceptibly on a single axis, and from the ground, on a clear night when the light caught it just right, it looked like an open eye. The name had stuck before the week was out. It did not attack, it did not land, it did not respond, it only watched. In the first month, electromagnetic surveys detected a fan of narrow beam radiation sweeping across every populated center on Earth in a methodical grid. Not dangerous, as far as anyone could tell. Not communications, just scanning. The beams swept with the patience of something that had no concept of impatience, and they reached everything. Underground bunkers, hospital basements, hardened military facilities. If you were somewhere with a roof over your head, the eye had measured you through it. The physics of how it penetrated reinforced concrete was something the science teams were still arguing about when the behavior change happened. On the first day of the second month, the blackouts began. Not power blackouts, signal blackouts. Every satellite the species had put into orbit, communications, GPS, weather, military reconnaissance, simply stopped working. Not destroyed, not knocked off their orbits, turned off as cleanly as a switch. Overnight, the world's data stream narrowed to fiber optic and ground-based radio, and half the population stopped being able to reach the other half. The financial markets were the first to break, then supply chains, then 3 governments in quick succession. The eye watched all of it. Dara had been stationed at Vashti by then, a small agricultural relay, settlement in what used to be central Kazakhstan, about as far from strategic relevance as it was possible to be. That, it turned out, was why it was still running when a lot of more important places were not. Nobody had bombed Vashti. Nobody had looted Vashti. It had a clinic, a machine shop, 4 functional crawlers, approximately 600 people, and enough dried stores to last 18 months if they were careful. Captain Reyes had put her in charge of the mechanical section. When Morrow broke his wrist in a brawl, she had stayed in charge because she was good at it, and nobody else wanted the job. She was not good at thinking about her daughter. Nini was 8 years old and had been in her mother's parents' house in Almaty when the blackouts hit. And as far as Dara knew, she was still there because the last ground relay message she had received, 9 weeks ago, had said exactly that in her father's stiff, careful handwriting. Lini is here. She is well. She asks about you every day. Do not worry. Dara thought about that message constantly and worried constantly and handled it by replacing bearings. She rolled out from under the crawler at 7 minutes to supply run, wiped her hands on a rag that was well past its useful life, and stood up into the cold. Across the yard, Tomas Garo was strapping canisters to the back of crawler 2 with the careful, economical movements of a man who had been doing physical labor since before he could read. Tomas was 53 years old, being missing his right index finger from a farming accident he was never precise about, and had a way of standing that made you feel the ground was more solid underneath him than it was underneath anyone else. He had been a sheep farmer before the eye came. He did not talk about before. Bearing replaced? He said without looking up. Good to go. Dust's coming from the east, I know. Might hit before we're back. Probably will, she said. We'll manage. He looked up at that. He had the kind of face that collected weather, seemed weathered, with deep-set dark eyes that registered information without apparent emotion. He studied her for a moment, the way he studied the sky, trying to determine if it was going to do something inconvenient. You heard from the signals team? Not since yesterday. There was another sweep last night, he said. Close one. Reyes wants everyone with signal-emitting equipment to go passive until further notice. That meant their one functioning satellite phone was mostly useless anyway, but which Dara had held on to because it had a photo of Leanie on it. Gap-toothed, 8 years old, standing in front of a fountain in Almaty that had been turned off since the 3rd month. She kept it in the inside pocket of her jacket where the battery would stay marginally warmer. She had not turned it on in 6 weeks. Noted, she said. They took 2 crawlers out onto the plane, Dara driving one and Tomas the other. Specialist Hira Osi, riding shotgun in Dara's cab, and doing what she always did on runs, which was eating something and looking at everything. Hira was 26 and had been a data analyst before, and she had preserved her professional habits by shifting her analytical attention from data, physical world which she consumed with the same restless thoroughness. She catalogued. She noticed. Northeast, Hira said, approximately 4 minutes out of Vashti. Dara did not need to ask what she meant. She could feel it in the quality of the light, that particular flattening, the sky going the color of old pewter. And when she glanced in the wing mirror, the eastern hills had gone amber and the dust was moving. How long? 40 minutes if we're lucky. 20 if we're not. Then we'll be quick. The supply cache was at the old Mednogorsk relay station, 10 kilometers out. A pre-I communications hub that had been retrofitted as a dead drop for the loose network of settlements that had formed, across the steppe. Somebody had left fuel cells, 2 medical crates, and a sack of signal-wrapped paper messages that had been relayed by hand along a chain of runners from somewhere east of Aktobi. Dara loaded while Hira sorted the messages and Tomas kept an eye on the dust. One for you, Hira said. The handwriting on the outside was her father's. She did not open it immediately. She loaded a fuel cell, and then another fuel cell, and then the medical crates. Working through the familiar physical sequence, because that was how she managed things, and then she sat down in the cab and tore the fold and read it. Leanie is still well. The eye has been scanning the city closely. 2 nights ago, there was a beam sweep that lasted 4 hours and covered everything down to the Medio Valley. People are frightened. I am not frightened, but I am concerned. I need to tell you something, Dara. I don't know how to say this in writing, so I will just say it. I have been talking to some people, engineers from the university, a few physicists, and someone who used to work at the ISE facility outside the city. They have a theory about the eye. They have been studying its scan patterns for 3 months, and they think they understand something about how it works. I cannot write it down here in case this message is intercepted, but I need you to come to Almaty. I know this is not easy. I know the roads are dangerous. But what these people are describing, if they are right, then doing nothing is more dangerous. Please come. Leanie misses you. I miss you, your father. She read it twice, then she folded it and put it in her breast pocket. The dust hit before they made it back. They drove through it with the headlights on in the middle of the day, the wipers throwing red-brown grit in arcs across the glass, and Dara did not speak the whole way. Tomas, in the other crawler, followed her lights like a dog following a scent. When they pulled into the Vashti yard and killed the engines, the settlement was sealed up, every door closed, every vent covered, and the air tasted of iron and old earth. That night she told Captain Reyes she needed compassionate leave to reach first her family in Almaty. Reyes was a small, compact woman in her 40s with close-cropped gray hair and the careful, deliberate speech of someone who had learned English as a 4th language and had since surpassed her teachers. She listened to everything Dara said without interrupting, which was her habit. And then she was quiet for a moment. You know what the road looks like. I've heard, knowing and hearing are different. I know, Dara said. I still need to go. Reyes studied her. There are checkpoints. Not all of them are operated by anyone you'd trust. The eye sweeps along the southern corridor heavily. Signals team picked up 17 grid passes over that route in the last 10 days. Anyone moving with electronic equipment is flagged. We've had runners go out through that zone and not come back. Then I'll travel dark. Tomas will want to go with you. Dara started to say she didn't need an escort. Then she remembered the way Tomas had studied her across the crawler yard, and she stopped herself. Tell him to pack for 6 days, she said. They left 2 mornings later before the light, with no electronics beyond a mechanical compass and a waterproofed paper map that Reyes's signals. Team had hand-annotated with the last known positions of checkpoints and eye-scan corridors. 2 bicycles, 1 pack apiece, water for 3 days, for 5, and a set of tools that Dara had selected on the reasoning that a broken machine was always a useful story. It was easy to explain. 2 people on bicycles in the middle of nowhere were there if they had the right kind of wrench in their hands and a convincing expression. Tomas rode ahead on the flat sections, and she rode ahead on the climbs. They did not talk much in the mornings. By the second day, the silence between them had the comfortable texture of long habit rather than avoidance. And she found she did not mind it. At midday on the second day, Tomas stopped on a ridge and pointed east. The beam was faint in the daylight, barely visible. A column of something that was not quite light, not quite radio, sweeping slowly across a hillside 4 kilometers away. It moved with the patience of something that had never been in a hurry. The hillside was empty of people as far as they could see, and the beam swept it anyway with the same careful attention it would have given to a city center. I always wondered, Tomas said, it's looking for. Maybe it doesn't matter what it's looking for. Maybe what matters is whether it finds it. He turned that over. You think it's looking for something specific. I think something that scans everything, constantly, for 4 months, without attacking, is building a picture. I think it's mapping us. Mapping us? For what? She did not answer because she did not know. Thanked Ed, and she had learned that Tomas respected the acknowledgement of not knowing more than he respected a confident, wrong answer. They swung south to avoid the scan corridor, adding 3 hours to the route, and camped that night in the ruins of a small roadside building whose function she couldn't determine. Something administrative, maybe, with filing cabinets tipped over and papers turned to paste by 2 seasons of weather. She lay in her sleeping bag and looked at the ceiling and thought about HFY's letter. She did not sleep well. On the 3rd day they found the checkpoint. It was not on the map. 4 men, a truck, a burned-out car positioned across the road as a barrier. The men had the look of people who had started out as some kind of legitimate authority and had continued as something less legitimate. It was a species she had learned to recognize in the last 4 months. The one in front was doing the talking, and the other 3 were doing the watching, and she did not like the way they looked at the bicycles. She kept her voice flat and bored. She had been a sergeant long enough to know that confident boredom was a specific and useful armor. Settlement maintenance. We've got a report of a broken relay unit at the Almaty Junction. Going to let us through? Or do you want to explain to the technicians why the Eastern Relay Grid goes dark next week? The man in front chewed that over. He had a radio on his hip, military surplus old model, she noted, and the aerial was up, which meant he was in contact with someone. That was the dangerous part, not him, whoever was on the other end. Where's your authorization? Paper authorization. Settlement authority. The checkpoint at kilometer 42 checked us through. They have the documentation. There was no checkpoint at kilometer 42. She was counting on him not knowing that. He looked at Tomas. Tomas looked back at him, with the expression of a man waiting for the weather to make up its mind. His missing finger was tucked under his other hand on the handlebar, not hidden exactly, just not offered. The moment stretched. Go, the man said. She did not exhale until they were 300 meters down the road. They reached the eastern outskirts of Almaty at dusk on the 5th day, when the city was settling into its evening quiet and the air had the particular dusty amber quality of a Central Asian autumn. The streets were not empty, but they were not full. People moved with the specific purposefulness of populations that have learned not to linger in open spaces, and she recognized it the same way she recognized her own reflection. She had been moving like that herself for months. Her father's house was in the Mediu district. Her mother had died 6 years ago, and since then her father had filled the house with books and a large gray cat named Euler, and had seemed genuinely to be contented. He opened the door before she could knock, which meant he had been watching for her, and he held her for a long moment without speaking. And she felt for the first time in months that she was the right size for where she was standing. Leni had been asleep for an hour. Her father let Dara stand in the doorway and watch her sleep for a moment. Her small face relaxed, breathing the deep, even rhythm of someone who was genuinely not afraid. And Dara looked at her daughter and felt something in her chest unknot that she had not known was knotted. She ate. She showered. She sat at her father's kitchen table, and he poured her tea, and they talked in low voices, while Tomas slept in the spare room. His name was Ascot. He was 64 years old, a retired structural engineer, and he had the precise, unhurried mind of a man who trusted equations more than intuitions but was not so rigid as to ignore an intuition when it was strong. The people he had been meeting with were a Dr. Fatima Suleymanova, astrophysicist, formerly of Al-Farabi University, a man who called himself Brandt, ex-Is, who had been in Almaty on leave when the eye arrived and had not left, and a small rotating group of 3 or 4 others. A woman who had been a signals engineer at a ground-based tracking station and had been correlating the eye's scan patterns for 3 months. "Show me," Dara said. He spread papers on the table. The signals engineer, her name was Polina Mar, had drawn the scan patterns by hand on topographical maps using colored pencil, and the effect was something like a geological survey and something like a fishing net laid over a landscape. The sweeps were not random. They had been random appearing for the first month, and then Polina had realized that the apparent randomness was itself a pattern, a deliberate misdirection, like a searcher who wanted you to think they were wandering when they were actually quartering. "It's not mapping geography," Ascat said. "That in the first 2 weeks. Look here, these dense concentrations. These are not population centers. Some of them are, but not all. This one," he tapped a cluster of overlapping lines east of the city, "is an abandoned industrial facility, empty for 12 years. Special about it. That's what Fatima figured out." He paused, finding the right page. "The commonality between all the high-concentration scan zones is geophysical. Mineral composition of the subsoil, specifically, and she can explain the physics better than I can, specific isotope concentrations in old volcanic formations." Dara looked at the map. Then she looked at her father. "It's looking for something underground." "We think so, and it has been doing this systematically for 4 months, and we don't believe it has found it yet. Because if it had found it, we think the behavior would change." "Change how?" He was quiet for a moment. "Brandt has access to some classified ESA structural analysis of the object. He obtained it before he lost his clearance. The eye is not built for observation alone. There are components, lower on the structure, not visible from the ground, that are consistent with some kind of directed energy system. Large scale. He thinks it is a harvesting mechanism." The kitchen was very quiet. The gray cat was on the windowsill, and outside the window the city was dark, and the sky was clear, and if she tilted her head at the right angle she could probably see the eye up there, small and black and patient. "It came here to mine," she said. "That's what we think. For us, for whatever is in the ground, we are incidental. We have always been incidental." He said it without self-pity, which was somehow worse than if he had. "The scanning, the satellite blackouts, all of it is preparation, clearing the field of view, mapping the deposits. And when it finds what it's looking for, it will use that system, and it will not matter much what is on the surface." She looked at the papers for a long time. She picked up Polina's maps and traced the scan paths with one finger, feeling the logic of the pattern under her fingertip like a machine's fingerprint. "What does Brandt say about the directed energy system? Vulnerabilities operational?" Ascat looked at her carefully. "He says there is a window. The harvesting mechanism requires a period of alignment, thermal calibration, orbital adjustment. During that period, the active scanning would need to stop, because the 2 systems apparently cannot operate simultaneously. A window of approximately 40 minutes. 40 minutes in which it is not watching." She put the map down. She picked up her tea. She looked at the steam rising off it. "I'm going to need to meet Brandt," she said. She found him the following morning in a basement below a closed bakery 2 streets over, which was a combination of circumstances that would have been funny in a different world. Brandt was a stocky German in his 50s with a gray beard, and the slightly unfocused quality of a man who had been inside for too long and was compensating with excessive coffee. He shook her hand and looked at Tomas with the frank suspicion of someone unaccustomed to trusting strangers, then apparently decided to trust them anyway, which she appreciated. He walked her through the structural analysis on a laptop screen, narrating in the rapid, slightly breathless cadence of a man who had been thinking about this alone for months and was only now getting to say it out loud. The directed energy system was real. The calibration window was real. And there was one more thing he had not put in his notes to her father, because he had not wanted to write it down. The eye is not a weapon, he said, not designed as one. During the calibration window, when the harvesting array is in its alignment phase, it is pointed directly downward, full power draw from the satellite's central systems. If you could get to sufficiently concentrate the electromagnetic pulse into the alignment array, during that window, the feedback would propagate through the whole system. That would take out the satellite. That would take out the satellite. She looked at him, and what kind of asset would generate that pulse? Something old, something analog, something it hasn't mapped and flagged because it isn't electronic enough to register on the scan. He smiled thinly. Do you know what a directed inductance burst transmitter is? She did not. But Tomas, from the corner where he had been listening with his arms folded and his expression unreadable, said, I know what a Tesla coil is. Turned to look at him. That's a simplified version of the same principle, yes. My father had one, Tomas said. He was an electrical engineer. It was his hobby. He built it in the barn. It was enormous and impractical, and the sheep hated it. He paused. He also built a directed inductance transmitter for a university project in 1987. He kept everything. I know where the barn is. The silence that followed had a particular texture. How far is the barn? Dara said. 300 kilometers. That's not impossible. No, Tomas agreed. It's not impossible. The next 6 days were not easy days. They went back to Vashti first because they had to, because Reyes needed to know, and because the machine shop at Vashti had tools and materials that they would need for the modifications, and because Dara was not the kind of person who disappeared from her post without explanation. She left Leni with her father with a fierceness in her chest that she managed by focusing on the practical. She checked the food stores. She checked the clinic's medications. She made her father write down the contact procedures for the settlement network, and she sat with Leni for 2 hours the morning she left and played cards, and told her that she was going to fix something that was broken and that she would come back. Leni, who was 8 years old and had not been sheltered from the truth of the last 4 months, considered this information with the same careful gravity she applied to most things. Is it the sky thing? She asked. Yes. How are you going to fix it? With an old machine, like the crawlers, older than that. Leni thought about it. Okay, she said, and went back to her cards, which was the most purely useful response anyone had given Dara in months. At Vashti, she had 3 days. Reyes listened to everything without interrupting, as was her habit, and at the end said, How sure is Brandt? 60%, Dara said, on a good day. That's not a lot. No, but the alternative is waiting, and the alternative has 100% probability of going wrong in a way nobody survives. Reyes was quiet. What do you need from me? The machine shop, 2 of my people, and a vehicle that can make 300 kilometers without being tracked. The crawler's too noisy. Take the fuel cell van. It's quieter and the EM signature is lower. She paused. Take Hira. She has a background in signal analysis, and she thinks faster than anyone here when something goes wrong. Hira, when asked, said obviously yes, and went to pack her analytical brain and her seemingly bottomless supply of things to eat. They drove north from Vashti in the fuel cell van, Dara and Hira and Tomas and Brandt, who had made the journey from Almaty by runner and road and arrived at the settlement, looking as though he had mostly slept in a ditch, which he had. The equipment in the back of the van was the product of 3 days of Dara's most concentrated mechanical work, a modified induction assembly built around the directional coil architecture in the paper Brandt had found in Tomas's father's notes, fitted with a targeting assembly that Hira had designed by hand on graph paper, and which looked, frankly, like something a very talented teenager had built for a physics fair. This was not a criticism. Dara had seen what talented teenagers could do when the stakes were right. Tomas's family farm was in a valley that had contracted since anyone last updated the maps. The farming stopped, and the buildings settling into a slow return to the steppe. The barn was intact. The machines inside were incredible. Tomas's father had been a man of enthusiasms. He had also been a man of the specific quality Dara was beginning to recognize as something distinctly human. The quality of doing something, not because it was useful but because it was interesting, preserving that work, not because it would ever be needed, but because it had been made with love. And things made with love deserved to exist. The transmitter was enormous and filthy, and the sheep that had hated it were long gone. But you could understand, looking at it, why they had hated it. It was the kind of machine that hummed with an intent that animals could feel. Brant walked around it like a pilgrim. "How long to modify for our purpose?" Dara said. "If you can replicate what's in these notes, and if that assembly you've built interfaces correctly, 12 hours, maybe 14. We have 11 before the alignment window. Then we have 11 hours, Brant said and began to work. Hira organized the parts. Tomas handled the heavy components. With the practiced ease of someone who had grown up knowing exactly where the structural limits of a machine were, Dara did the integration, the point where human work met old machine and new design, the careful threading of the induction coil assembly into the transmitter's output stage. She worked by lamp in the cold barn, and she thought about Lenny and used the thought as fuel instead of letting it be a distraction. It was a skill she had spent 8 months developing. At hour 7, Hira looked up from her graph paper schematics and said, "I need you to look at something." Dara looked. The problem was in the targeting assembly, a resonance issue that would scatter the pulse across 20 degrees of arc instead of focusing it. In theory, she studied Hira's diagrams. The math was solid. Physical implementation had a tolerance issue. "We need a different coupling," Dara said. "We don't have one. We have a bearing housing from the crawler repair kit. That's not what it's designed for." "No," Dara agreed. "But look at the internal diameter. If we machine down the collar." Hira looked. Then she looked at the bearing housing. Then at the transmitter's output coupling. "That is insane." "That's accurate. But it would work." "Yes," Dara said. "I believe it would." She machined the collar by hand in the barn's old metalworking vise, by lamplight, using a file and a set of calipers, and the kind of focused patience that had got her through 2 combat deployments, a difficult divorce, and 4 months of watching the sky. Tomas held the lamp and did not offer unsolicited advice, which she appreciated. Hira checked the tolerance at intervals with a measuring tape and a small digital level whose battery was nearly dead, and which she shook periodically to coax another reading. The bearing housing fit, not perfectly, but within tolerance. "That," said Brant, who had been watching the last part of this operation from a safe distance, "is remarkable." "It's a bearing," Dara said. "It's a bearing doing the work of a precision optical coupling in a directed inductance burst system intended to destroy an alien harvesting satellite. It's still a bearing," she said and went back to work. With 40 minutes to the window, the transmitter was ready. They rolled it to the barn door on a platform that Tomas had improvised from equipment trolleys, and Dara stood in the open doorway and looked at the sky. The night was absolutely clear. The eye was visible. She could see it now with naked eyes. A small, steady point of light that did not twinkle, that did not move, that had been watching the world with its cold, unblinking attention for 4 months and 17 days. Her hands were steady. She thought about the scan beams sweeping the steppe, the methodical quartering of a machine that had no impatience, no doubt, no concern for anything that was not the task it had been sent to complete. She thought about the blackouts, and the broken supply chains, and the 3 governments, and the checkpoint on the road to Almaty, and all the runners who had not come back. She thought about Polina Mar drawing scan paths by hand, on topographical maps with colored pencil. She thought about Brant in his basement, alone with classified documents and too much coffee, working through the math of the thing that was watching him. She thought about her father saying, "We are incidental." She thought about Leni playing cards. And then she thought about Tomas's father, the electrical engineer, who had built something enormous and impractical that the sheep hated. Not because it would ever be needed, because it was interesting, because it was made with love. Because human beings did that. They made things with love and kept them, and sometimes those things waited in barns for 30 years for the specific, improbable moment they were needed. She had not expected to feel what she felt at that moment, which was something she could only describe as humor. Not the sharp edge of it, but the deep variety, the kind that lives next to grief and alongside fear, and does not cancel either of them but exists anyway, because the situation was genuinely, absurdly, magnificently strange. And she was a woman standing in a barn in Kazakhstan, holding a bearing housing that had been machined to tolerances it was not designed for. About to fire a directed electromagnetic pulse at an alien surveillance satellite in the name of a species that had not known 4 months ago that it needed defending. Brant, she said. Window. He was watching a hand-wound mechanical clock. 4 minutes, Hira. Targeting confirmation. Locked, Hira said. Her voice was perfectly level. She had eaten something. She had eaten something, Dara noticed, and this somehow seemed important and correct. And her graph paper schematics were spread on the workbench behind her, weighed down by a wrench and a coffee mug, and she was holding the targeting assembly's manual adjustment by hand with the precise, unhurried grip of a woman who had spent 3 days making this thing and was not going to let it slip now. Thomas, Dara said. He was at the power coupling. He looked at her. In the lamplight his face was its usual seamed, weather-reading self. He had a small flask in his chest pocket. She had seen it before and never commented, and before he put his hand on the power switch he took it out and held it toward her. She shook her head. He tucked it away. 30 seconds, Brant said. She put her hand on the fire control. The mechanical clock ticked. Outside the barn, the steppe was dark and enormous, and the sky was extraordinary, the kind of sky you get far from cities, where the Milky Way is not an abstraction but a physical fact, a road of light that ancient people had navigated by, that sailors and nomads and shepherds had used to know where they were and where they were going. All of it was up there, everything they had ever named and everything they had not, and one small thing that had come from somewhere else, that had watched them for 4 months and found them unimportant, that did not know what it was looking at. 15 seconds, Brant said. She thought, you don't know we're here. 10, she thought. You've been watching this whole time and you still don't know. 5, she thought. About a woman drawing scan paths on a map with colored pencils. She thought about an old machine and the hands that made it. She thought about Leanie's face, asleep in the lamplight. Window, she fired. The transmitter made a sound she had not anticipated. Not a crack or a bang, but a sustained, enormous note, almost musical. The kind of sound that comes from something releasing stored tension all at once. And the barn lit up blue-white in a way that printed itself on the back of her retinas for a long time afterward. Kira held the targeting assembly perfectly still. Tomas held the coupling. Brant held the clock and did not move. The note held for 4 seconds and then cut cleanly, the way a circuit breaks. Silence. Dara looked up through the barn door at the sky. Point of light that had been the electric eye was still there for 6 seconds. Then it was not steady anymore. It moved, not smoothly, gracefully, but with the irregular tumbling of something that had lost its orientation axis. It traced a small arc across the field of stars. Then it flared, bright, briefly as bright as anything she had ever seen in the night sky, and went out. The sky closed over it like water. Nobody spoke for a while. Kira sat down on the workbench. Tomas leaned against the barn wall. Brant put the clock in his jacket pocket, with the careful movements of a man managing his hands. Because they were not quite steady, Dara stood in the barn doorway and looked at the sky. It was just the sky now. The Milky Way was where it had always been. The stars were where they had always been. The night was cold and clear, and the steppe was dark and vast and empty of any presence that did not belong to it. She thought about all the things that would not fix themselves, the communications networks, the supply chains, the 3 governments, the checkpoints with their broken radios, and their frightened men. All of it would take months or years, and some of it might not fix itself at all, because the world had already moved on from what it had been, and some things, once shifted, do not go back. She thought about her daughter asleep in Almaty. She thought about a runner carrying a paper letter by hand across a steppe, stopping at relays, changing hands, finding its way to a settlement in Kazakhstan that was still running because it was too small and too unimportant for anyone to bother with. Carrying the words of a father to a daughter across a landscape that had been put to good use by human beings long before satellites existed. She thought about how it was possible to watch something for 4 months and still not understand it. She turned around. Hira was still sitting on the workbench. She had opened something to eat, as was her nature, and she was eating it in the way of someone who needed to let her hands do something ordinary while her mind processed the non-ordinary. Tomas was still leaning against the wall. He had the flask out now, and he held it toward her again. And this time she walked over and took it and drank. It was cheap vodka, the kind that tasted like a sincere apology, and it burned going down exactly as much as she needed it to. "Well," he said. "Yes," she said. He took the flask back. He looked at the sky through the barn door. He put the flask away. "We should get back," he said. "Your daughter's waiting." She nodded. She picked up her jacket from where she had set it on the workbench. In the breast pocket, her phone, dead these 8 weeks, pressed against her. When she curled her hand around it, thin and light, and containing a photograph of a gap-toothed girl in front of a fountain that wasn't running, she thought, "Tomorrow I'll find a way to charge this." She thought, "I'll show her the sky." Outside the barn, the night was the coldest it had been, and the stars were everywhere. And there was nothing up there that did not belong. She thought about all the things she would need to tell Reyes when they got back. The satellite network would not restore on its own. Someone would have to rebuild it, or learn to live without it, or both. The settlements along the steppe corridor were still out of contact with each other, and with anything further away. The checkpoints were still out there on the roads. None of the damage the 4 months had done was automatically undone by one pulse, fired from an old barn. She knew all that, she had always known all that. But the thing watching from above was gone, and that changed the geometry of the problem in a way that was hard to overstate. What the eye had done, mostly, was take away the future, not through direct violence, but through the particular horror of being watched by something you could not affect, could not communicate with, not understand. It had watched and waited and mapped, and the waiting had eaten at people, eaten at governments, at organizations, at the structures that held things together. Because the waiting implied a purpose that hadn't yet arrived, and not knowing what that purpose was had been its own kind of violence. The world had begun to make increasingly bad decisions out of a fear it couldn't name because the thing causing the fear had never announced itself. That, she thought, was the real damage, not the blackouts. The blackouts could be repaired. The real damage was 4 months of a species making smaller and smaller circles because something was watching from above, and they didn't know why. Now it wasn't watching. Now they could begin the longer argument about what came next. Brant was pulling on his jacket. He looked lighter, she thought. Not lighter as in less worried. Brant was constitutionally incapable of being less worried, but lighter as in the specific weight of particular thing had lifted. He would find other things to worry about immediately, and he would be entirely right to find them. This weight was gone. "There will be others," he said. "Maybe not the same type, maybe not soon. Whatever sent this one knows where we are now." "Yes," she said. "We should talk about what to do with Polina's scan maps. The data in those maps tells us something about what the thing was looking for and where it was concentrating. If we use that data forward—" "I know," she said. "We will not tonight." He looked at her. He understood. "Not tonight," he agreed. Tomas had gone outside while they talked, and when Dara followed, she found him standing in the open ground in front of the barn, looking straight up. No flask. Hands in his pockets. Looking the way she had sometimes seen him look at a weather system on the horizon. Reading it, taking its measure, determining whether it was going to do something he needed to account for. She stood beside him. The step went out in every direction to distances that felt personal, like a relationship rather than a measurement. Somewhere east of them, 300 kilometers, her daughter was sleeping. Somewhere in the sky above them, pieces of the thing that had watched them were beginning the long falling process that would take them weeks or months to complete, burning apart in the atmosphere, becoming nothing. "Your father knew," she said. Tomas was quiet for a moment. he built a lot of things. He liked to say that a thing made carefully would find its use eventually. I always thought it was an eccentric thing to say. And now, he thought about it with the same patience he applied to weather. Now, I think he was right, he said. Thinks sometimes the use takes a long time to arrive. I think that's all right. She nodded. The cold was settling more heavily now, the kind of pre-dawn cold that makes itself known through the joints. She could hear Hira behind them in the barn, chewing something. She had found another thing to eat, which was absolutely characteristic and somehow enormously comforting. And Brant's voice, low, explaining something to no one in particular, because he had been alone with his thoughts for so long that the explaining was its own kind of relief. In the sky, the stars were doing what stars do, which is nothing and everything simultaneously. They were the same stars her daughter looked at from her grandfather's window in Almaty. They were the same stars Polina Marr had looked at while drawing scan paths on a topographic map in colored pencil. They were the same stars that sailors had used to navigate, and nomads had used to know the season, and shepherds had used to know the hour, and all those people had been watched by those stars indifferently and had gone on about their business. The sky did not owe anyone anything, neither did they. She pulled her jacket tighter against the cold and turned back toward the barn. There was a long drive ahead, and a settlement to report to, and a daughter to wake up and hold, and a world that was broken in several hundred ways that would require the sustained, creative, unglamorous application of human energy to repair. She was good at that kind of work. She had always been good at that kind of work. She paused at the barn door and looked up one more time. Nothing, just the sky, belonging to no one, open in every direction, full of everything that was still out there, and everything that had not arrived yet, and everything that they did not know about, and everything they would face when the time came. She went inside. The drive back to Vashti took 2 days. The dust storms had mostly moved east, and the roads were as quiet as roads in the steppe ever were, which was not the same as safe but was navigable. And Dara drove the first stretch while Hira slept in the back, and Brant sat in the passenger seat, reading Polina's maps by flashlight and making small occasional sounds of scientific interest. Tomas drove the second stretch, because he said he slept better driving, which was something Dara chose not to examine too closely. They stopped once at a well outside a small farming village, and the village was operational. Smoke from chimneys, a child watching them from a doorway, a man with a bucket who looked at them with the guarded assessment of the last 4 months, and then nodded when he decided they were not a threat. She nodded back. He filled his bucket and went inside. Normal commerce of strangers. She had not realized until that moment how much she had missed normal commerce of strangers. At the well, she used a hand pump to rinse the remaining hydraulic fluid from her forearms, the last physical trace of the bearing she had replaced in the Vashti yard a week ago. The water was very cold. She scrubbed carefully and then stood in the morning air, with her arms wet, and looked out across the plain. The plain was the same. It had been the same yesterday, and it would be the same tomorrow. The steppe had absorbed the invasions of many things over many centuries, armies, empires, droughts, ice ages, and had continued being the steppe. She found this at present consoling. In the van, Brant handed her a thermos of tea. She did not ask where he had gotten it. She drank it, and it was good. "I need to say something," he said. "All right. I've been thinking about this since last night." He looked out the window. "We were not the designers of the solution. We were the assemblers. Polina's maps, your father's letter, the notes from a dead man's barn, your bearing, the coil itself." He paused. "None of that was designed for this purpose. It was assembled by people who communicated by hand-carried paper, drew scan patterns in colored pencil, who kept machines that no one thought would ever matter." He stopped again. "Worked in institutions my entire professional life. I know how institutions solve problems. They designate resources, establish timelines, purpose-built solutions. What we did was different. We used what was there," she said. "Yes. And what was there because individual human beings had preserved it, learned it, kept it for reasons that had nothing to do with this crisis. Your friend's father built a transmitter because he thought it was interesting. Polina stayed in Almaty because she couldn't get out. And she spent her time mapping instead of waiting. You kept a bearing housing in a repair kit. Because it was part of the standard kit. And you run a complete kit. He seemed to be working towards something. I've been thinking about what the eye was mapping. It was mapping resources, deposits, quantifiable, extractable, measurable things. It was very good at that, and it didn't see us at all. We weren't resources. No, we were the noise in the data. He looked at her. I think that was its miscalculation. We have always been very good at being noise, at being unpredictable, at preserving things that have no immediate use because we find them interesting or beautiful or worth keeping, at communicating through inefficient channels because the efficient channels are gone, at solving problems with the wrong tools. He stopped. I think. When it looked at us, it saw low probability threat. And I think it was right about all of its measurements and wrong about that. Conclusion. She drove for a while without answering. The Stepa went by. The van's fuel cell hummed. We're going to need people like Polina, she said finally. When everything starts coming back online, people who spent the last 4 months watching and mapping and thinking, not because anyone told them to, but because it was what they could do. Those people are going to know things nobody else knows. I know where most of them are, Brandt said. I've been in contact by paper, by runner for 2 months. There's a network, informal, scientists, engineers, analysts, people who couldn't stop doing their work just because the infrastructure was gone. He paused. They'll need organizing. That sounds like a job for someone with institutional experience, she said. He looked at her. I'm a settlement maintenance sergeant, she said. My skill set is mechanical. Your skill set, from what I've observed in the last week, is considerably broader than that. She thought about it for a while. Talk to Reyes first, she said. She thinks bigger than I do. And, after Reyes, we figure out the next problem. She checked the wing mirror. Nothing. The road behind them was empty and the sky above it was clear and ordinary. There'll be a next problem. Almost certainly. Then we'd better be organized when it arrives. The van hummed across the plain. Brandt went back to Polina's maps. In the back, had woken up and was eating something with the quiet contentment of a person who believes that the correct response to large events is to be adequately nourished and attentive. Tomas's eyes were on the horizon, reading it, always reading it. They reached Vashti in the afternoon of the second day, when the light was long and amber over the settlement, and Reyes was in the yard with 2 of the signals team, and they all stood and watched the van come in without speaking until it stopped. And then Reyes walked up and looked at Dara through the window for a moment. Done, she said. Done, Dara said. Reyes nodded. She looked at the sky. She looked back at Dara. Then come inside, she said. We have work. They went inside. They began the work. Outside, the sky continued being the sky. The steppe sky. Enormous and indifferent and full of everything that was and everything that would come. And it watched nothing and owed nothing. And it was exactly enough.